want to warmly welcome all of you by saying good afternoon, bonjour, bon dia, assalamu alaikum, and obviously being in Kenya, habari, as a Kenyan way in welcoming you. My name is Ibrahima Sheikh Diong. I am from the beautiful country of Senegal, but I am here also as United Nations Assistant Secretary General, but also the Director General of the African Race Capacity from the African Union. Now, given the amount of speakers that we have and the excitement for this panel, we're going to skip the protocol and get right into the bottom of why we're here. Now, for those who are following up the conversation we're having so far, there seems to be a consensus. What's being committed for adaptation may be falling short for African expectation. So therefore, that's why this event is extremely important. There's also a consensus. We need to continue mobilizing resources, both domestically, globally, in Africa, to meet the huge funding need of adaptation in Africa. And I could not think of a better panel to have a conversation about mobilizing resources. Last but not least, the mere fact that this session is called Unlocking Adaptation recognizes there are opportunities to be unlocked. The question is, do we need to review the governance of climate finance? Do we need to forge the right partnership? Do we need to innovate? It's not business as usual. And you don't have to listen to me because our panelists will delve into all these issues in a way that we can walk away with some commitment, but also some suggestion about how do we unlock adaptation finance, but also make sure we deliver for Africa. Our session is divided into three parts. We're going to start with our heads of states and some of our dignitaries. We're going to be making some opening remarks. And then second, I have two panels. One with heads of state called the presidential panel, which I will get the chance to ask them some tough questions, but also some questions so they can share their perspective. Last but not least, we have what we call the institutional panel. We'll invite some institutions that are involved in climate adaptation so they can tell us what commitment they're prepared to make so we can deliver for Africa at the end of this summit. Without further ado, it is my distinguished honor to invite Senator John Kerry, Special Envoy for Climate Change for the United States of America. Senator Kerry, the floor is yours, and give him a round of applause.
Introducing me, and thank you all for being here at this really, I think, transformational moment with respect to adaptation. I will confess to you that and nobody's put me under duress to do this, but you know, earlier in the COPs that we have attended, and I've attended COPs since the very beginning in 1992. 1992 was the creator of the COPs, actually, the Earth Summit in Rio. Back then, adaptation was really the stepchild of almost everybody who was involved in it. People thought, oh gosh, adaptation now, we're going to beat this. We're going to get ahead of the curve on it. And there was an expectation that, you know, most places were going to be able to take care of themselves, et cetera. Obviously, that proved to be woefully, hugely wrong. And we've delayed and lost time. And adaptation is now critical because the world is behind in this endeavor. There's just too much business as usual, as I said earlier upstairs. And we've got to break the code of business as usual. This is an emergency, urgent. It's urgent around the world. And when the scientists are telling us that we could be standing on the brink of 5 individual tipping points, then you have to sort of stop and say to yourself, well, what are the consequences of those tipping points if you pass them? What are they? This comes from Johann Rockström, who I have great respect for, who is a lead scientist, the director of the Potsdam Institute. The potential boundaries that we have gone beyond certainly begin with the coral reefs, secondly, the Barents Sea, thirdly, and beginning to rise in their crisis level, the permafrost. And as the permafrost thaws in Siberia and Alaska, various parts of the world, massive amounts of 40,000-year locked up methane are released. And methane, as you all know, in its early years is 80 to 100 times more potent in damage and destructiveness than carbon dioxide. And in its later years, it goes down to something like 20 times more, which you can't really feel good about, because 20 times, if you look at CO2, it's destructive enough. 20 times that is a freebie for methane, which is why we created the methane pledge, and we're now trying to get countries to step up and agree to capture that methane. And that was a pledge we put forward in Glasgow, but it wasn't done in the context of adaptation. Now, adaptation, we have learned, is now, I guess it's a manifestation to some degree of the failure of people to sort of get ahead of the curve. Because the reason it's now so much front and center is that so many more people are at risk. So many more people are being hurt. So many more communities are being destroyed. So many more events are taking place, which could, if you had adapted, which could have saved lives. And needless to say, adaptation is tough in some ways because it doesn't usually lend itself. It does occasionally, but it doesn't usually lend itself to a profit-making, money-making proposition. And so the big money that we need to affect this transition is not available. Now, many of you know that when we began to hear about the adaptation issue from people who were sort of ahead of the curve with respect to what the impacts were, adaptation was deemed to be sort of less important than mitigation, because everybody said, oh, we're going to mitigate. And if we mitigate enough, we will take away the capacity to have adaptation be more imperative. Well, that didn't happen either. Mitigation, we're still going up in emissions, except for a couple of places. And the rise of emissions is a danger to every single person in this room, every person in the world. So adaptation has now been made critical because more and more people are exposed, and because of where we are in the curve of reducing emissions, we know that a whole bunch more people are going to be greatly impacted, at risk of life and limb, and communities destroyed, because this is going to continue. This year is better. If you measure where we are in this last curve, look at the last 10 years. Every year hotter than the next, almost. Every year more events taking place that cost more money. And we're on a cycle where we see that we're just sort of breeding these events in a way. And so different things become important. Adaptation, building an early warning system, that's adaptation. Making sure people have the ability to seek cover, building those shelters or areas out of the sea's reach, which people could take refuge, that's adaptation. Crops that are at risk and maybe terminally at risk. If we can't build resilience in those crops, or if we can't, and some people won't like that because it's GMO, process, and there's some folks who won't go near that. So we have all kinds of hurdles to get over in this, but we have to urgently decide what our priorities are in terms of building this resilience into our communities. Disease, another threat. As it gets warmer, diseases don't die out where they used to die out. You also don't have certain kinds of insects and predators die out the way they used to. So beetle bark, you have unbelievable numbers of trees destroyed every year, which is a loss of sink. that takes place as a consequence of the lack of hardening of those by preventing that from happening. Now, some of what I've just described to you, it falls into this slot of, the changes taking place with the methane, which is even more damaging, as I said. But here, I only listed 3 of the tipping points. And the most grave of those that I mentioned is obviously the methane, the permafrost. But here are the 2 gigantic ones. And I visited both places to find out more about it. The Antarctic and the Arctic. The rate of melting in the Arctic is 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. I've landed in an airplane up on that ice sheet, and you can look out and see massive amount of water flowing underneath. Look down this hole 100 feet deep. Torrential river, just melting, going out into the ocean every day. I went to a fjord where the ice is breaking off. The ice breaks off. 86 million metric tons of ice every single day melting and falling into the sea and going out and melting. 86 million metric tons, just to give you an idea, is enough water for greater New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut for an entire year, every day. Now, if you don't think that's worrying, then you're not paying attention to the facts and the realities. So that's where we are, folks. If the Antarctic and the Arctic over the next 100 years, perhaps, it's not something that's going to happen in 10 years, and we shouldn't be scaring people with anything but facts. I mean, the reality is it's going to happen at a steady rate. You've got miles deep ice, but it's melting faster and faster. And we're already seeing sea level rise. And we're already seeing island states whose adaptation has now become leaving their island state. And that may grow in amount. So every continent, every country, everywhere in the world is experiencing this. And it's inevitable. We must save the lives we can. We have a responsibility to be thoughtful about building resilience into communities where that can help to reduce money, reduce cost outlays. I mean, insurance. We have insurance companies that have now pulled out of insuring homes in various parts of the United States. I don't know about everywhere else. But it's changing life, changing business, changing all the rules. So no place has been as greatly impacted with respect to food security than Africa. And that is a mighty large challenge, because what can happen, obviously, is if the food production capacity of a place like Africa failed utterly, just collapses, then you're going to have migration that defies the imagination. And when you have migration at great amounts and people looking for water and looking for shade, looking for a temperature you can live in, you will have conflict, which is why our military personnel say we have largest conflict. There's a conflict multiplier in what is happening with respect to the climate now. So that's why the United States is supporting this effort, specifically the Africa Adaptation Initiative and the Food Security Accelerator that we launched at COP27 together. And that is going to support African entrepreneurs operating climate-smart food businesses. And there are already entrepreneurs in Rwanda, for instance, finding ways to better process a local drought-resistant crop, cassava, and that will replace wheat flour. The accelerator can help grow these small, medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. We've made good on our $25 million pledge from COP27, and earlier today I announced we're going to put another $20 million into that effort, and that brings our overall investment in the accelerator to $45 million. And the calls for proposals for this opens at the end of September. So those of you who want to think about partaking, we're inviting African entrepreneurs to submit ideas and innovations so together we can build towards a climate resilient, food resilient, secure Africa. Let me just close by saying, look, we also announced $10 million to a technical assistance facility under the Climate Resilience and Adaptation Technical Finance and Technology Fund. I don't know who makes up these names, but the accelerator, but there's something like cold chain storage, which would help maintain soils and in a high protein, fiber, and iron. And there's a market for fonio in the U.S. People everywhere want nutritious crops that can withstand the effect of climate. And through the VACs, we are going to help mobilize investments that make that happen. So my friends, VACs is working rapidly, and these new announcements I've just made are in addition to the $100 million that we announced in July for the Vision Adapted Crop Soils, that is the VACs, and we made that announcement this July of $100 million. So, folks, the fight for food security is a fight for global security. And it's a fight to protect people against disease, against all of the negative implications of what happens with respect to the continued damage we're going to witness. There's a sobering thought, which most scientists will confirm. This year was worse than last year. Last year was better than this year. This year will be better than next year and the year after. That is what we are looking at if you want to be realistic and honest with the evidence we're facing. So there's nothing to prevent us from speeding up but us, ourselves. This is a human-made problem. It's subject to a human solution. And we all know what that solution is. Stop polluting with greenhouse gases and start building out the renewables, the alternative energy, all the technologies that will make life safer, healthier, much cleaner, and in the long run, much more prosperous than it is today. So thanks all for being part of this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Senator John Kerry, for reminding us that a human-made problem has to come up with human solutions. Now, he was the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations. He's been a chair and president of the Global Green Growth Institute. Join me in welcoming Ban Ki-moon as our next speaker.
Your Excellency Julius Maada Bonipo, President of Sierra Leone, Her Excellency Saleh Jude, President of Ethiopia, His Excellency Mustafa Matboli, Prime Minister of Egypt, Honorable John Kerry, and I really thank for his very excellent statement just now. Honorable Huang Lunchu, Minister of Ecology and Environment of China, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, hello and good afternoon. Hujambo and Habarija Jamchana. Thank you. In my capacity as President of the Assembly and the Chairman of the Council of the Global Green Growth Institute, I'd like to welcome all of you to this very important occasion. And I thank for your strong passion and compassion to deal with climate change, thus realizing a green economy. First of all, I understand that President Ali Bongo of Gabon was supposed to open this important event with me. As you know, there was a coup d'etat in Gabon just last week, and President Bongo is not able to join us. Therefore, I'd like to take this opportunity to express my deepest concerns and utmost wish for a speedy and peaceful resolution based on the principles of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, we are all gathered here at the Africa Climate Summit because we are facing a pivotal moment with a growing urgent threat that transcends national borders, races, and social class, the climate crisis. As leaders, it is our duty to ensure the security and well-being of our people, but the rapidly changing climate threatens the very fabric of our societies, and its impacts are not waiting for anyone. Today, it is virtually impossible to read the newspapers or watch the news without coming across headlines about unprecedented heat waves, droughts, or floods, and more destructive weather events that lead to food insecurity, water scarcity, and climate refugees, the displacement of communities due to climate change. Whether we want to admit it or not, climate change is already here. It is a daily reality. And the poorest communities in Africa and elsewhere, although they are the least to be responsible for climate change, they are feeling the impact the hardest. Therefore, as the President of the Assembly and Chair of the Council of the Global Green Growth Institute, GGGI, I would like to share about a transformative solution in the making. The Africa and Middle East SAFE Initiative, SAFE Initiative, with SAFE standing for Scaling Up Climate Resilient Agriculture and Food System Transformation and Economic Development. By placing food security at the forefront, the initiative will aim to pave the way for comprehensive actions and to focus on enhancing food security, improving livelihoods, and creating jobs with the potential to mobilize 10 billion through public-private partnerships in Africa and Middle East. The initiative, which would reflect the priorities of African and Middle East countries, is also aligned with the objectives of the United Arab Emirates COP28 presidency and the Sustainable Development Goal number 2, Zero Hunger, and could yield remarkable benefits by transforming millions of hectares of farmland into resilient agriculture, substantially reducing carbon emissions, increasing food exports, and providing sustainable farming opportunities for millions of households. I am proud that GGGI is playing an important supporting role already and facilitating the convergence of many stakeholders for this initiative. GGGI's mission is to support its member states' transition to green growth and sustainable development, and it stands ready to help countries of these two key regions come together. But to ensure that our words and ideas will lead to action and real tangible change, we need everyone. Through the Africa and Middle East SAFE Initiative in the making, I hope many of you will join us in this opportunity to collaborate so we can amplify our collective efforts. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, during this event, you will hear from a very diverse group of leaders and experts about their insights, experiences, and ideas, and you will get to discuss the government policies, business opportunities, and societal benefits. In short, all the challenges we face and the opportunities we can seize. But this is more than a discussion. It is a call to action, and it is an invitation to all of you to contribute and collaborate so we can build a more sustainable and resilient world for all. Ladies and gentlemen, not a single country in this world, however powerful and resourceful one may be, one cannot handle this climate crisis. We have to put, and we have joined all our hands on the deck together, And I really thank you for your participation. And I think it is our political responsibility for those in power, in office, and those not in office. This is a moral power, moral responsibility. Therefore, as a former Secretary General of the United Nations, I think I have moral responsibility to speak out. At the same time, as I am working as chairperson and president of GGGI, I have also some political responsibility. So ladies and gentlemen, let us work together to make sure that our planet Earth and our humanity can live in peace and sustainable way. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
And thank you, Your Excellency Ban Ki-moon, for your continued passion and commitment, but also for putting food security at the heart of our conversation, adaptation. But thank you again for talking about the new initiative that you're launching, which I'm sure will go a long way in making sure Africa adapt, particularly when they come to food security. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the close of our opening ceremony. We're now going to move into two sessions, and that session will start first of all with heads of states, and then we'll have another institutional panel where we can discuss a little bit more in detail some of the commitments that need to be made so we can adapt in Africa. It is my distinguished honor to welcome on stage His Excellency, the President of Sierra Leone, and I ask you to give him a round of applause. I always take a joy for the next person I'm introducing. I would like to invite Madam President on stage from the President of Ethiopia. I also like to invite on stage Her Excellency Barbara Koffer, Parliamentary State Secretary from Germany. And Dr. Yasmin Fouad Abdelaziz to join us, sitting in for the Prime Minister of Egypt. Dr. Yasmin. Thank you. All right, so what we're going to try to do in this panel, just to take away some of the statement we heard from the opening remark, and bring it down to West Africa, but also bring it down globally in Africa, to understand what needs to be done for us to scale up. I'm going to start with the President of Sierra Leone, His Excellency Julius Maada Bio, just to walk us through adaptation from a West African perspective. Where do we see the challenges and what needs to be done to scale up so we can actually respond to the needs of West Africa? His Excellency.
Thank you very much. I think there's no gainsaying the many challenges that we all face around the world due to climate change, and therefore the need for us to find ways to adapt to the challenges so that at least we can survive as human beings. First, our livelihoods, which is very important, and of course the many disruptions that it can cause us, and of course, like I said, as human beings, we always find a way to stay alive. There are a lot of things to be done in Africa and from the West African point of view, but I think this is climate change impact are global in nature, and therefore the solutions can almost be shared among nations in terms of trying to adapt even the way. For us in Sierra Leone, I have chosen food security this time round to be able to feed Sierra Leone with the main staple food and of course the other agricultural products, food security in general. When you look at that, you find out that it is diametrically opposed if we don't do it in a climate-smart way. Agriculture or food production definitely impacts the environment. And so with that in mind, we have to now make sure that we adapt our agricultural methods the way we use water, and the many things that we do in agriculture, so that we don't adversely affect the environment in such a way that it is not sustainable. But of course, we also know that this is going to always involve some amount of either technology, finance, and so on and so forth. It is easier said than done. So that is where we find ourselves, in a quagmire where we want to develop, where we want to do things, and yet we are restricted because we need to do them differently from how we've been doing them so that we don't disturb our environment. So I think what I want to speak or talk about at this particular point in time is that for us who are in haste to develop, we are definitely in a bind. I want to, I said, food production, which means I have to use as much land as possible, as much water as possible, but then now we are feeling the impact of climate change. So how do I manage the two? And that is where the adaptation is and the cost associated with it. But I think, again, as human beings, we are very smart. Necessity is the mother of invention. So we have to find a way to feed our people while not destroying the very environment, the soil, and the other resources necessary. This is what I would say at the beginning.
That since morning we have heard this key word, adaptation, which shows that it's no more an option. It's a necessity, because if you don't adapt, we've seen droughts, flooding, and so on. The loss of fertility of lands, which has decreased by 34%, I think, since 1961, and so on and so forth. So we have to adapt, change the way of life, our development plans, productivity, and so on. We lose in productivity, but we increase in population. So there are all these problems. Now, since the topic for our discussion is scaling up, I would like to focus on what is being done on the continent with the support of the African Development Bank and the Global Center on Adaptation, this AAAP, African Adaptation Acceleration Program. And I think this is something that can bring some solution, because it will increase the finance in many areas. And this program is meant to double climate adaptation to Africa by 2025. And the plan, according to what we know from the bank and the GCA, by the way, is to mobilize $25 billion US dollars by 2025 in order to accelerate climate adaptation investments in Africa, mainly in 4 areas. And of course, everybody would know what we talk about, because the number 1 priority area would be agriculture, obviously, and to have this climate smart agriculture, a resilient infrastructure. We have seen how many of our roads and bridges go away with flooding and so on. We know how to live with that. The youth innovation and job creation, and the innovative finance. So to reach this 25 billion, ADB has promised to mobilize half of it through its normal investment operations, and raise the additional 12.5 billion in partnership with this Global Center on Adaptation. I'm very happy to see, and I heard it, I didn't know that this morning, that the regional office of the GCA will be here in Nairobi. So I think that proximity will also help. So the GCA also has established what they call this upstream facility to support and design preparation of all investment operations and special initiatives under, again, this AAAP program of the ADB, so that we can attract finance at scale. So this facility is hosted again by the Global Center on Adaptation, and has been working with the African Development Bank to strengthen climate adaptation and resilience design. Agriculture, resilient infrastructure, as I said, I think it's 1 billion something for agriculture, 3 for this, youth and jobs. I said it in my national statement earlier, but the first part of what we should be doing is investing on youth, which is absolutely important, because we'll have more and more difficulty explaining to youth this discrepancy and injustice that we are seeing. So I think, to me, since the question that we have in this session is how to scale up adaptation, I think this is a very big window that we have through the ADB. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Madam President. We are delighted to be joined by another heads of states, His Excellency Isaac Afwerki, President of Eritrea. Mr. President, my question to you, reflecting on the experience of your country, trying to link food security and climate change, I wonder if you could just share with us what would it take to scale up for Africa to get additional resources for adaptation. Mr. President.
I think I would like to start with, this stereotype of everyone coming and making statements, PR statements about achievements wouldn't make any sense. Let's be focused, okay? I will not talk about our achievements in agriculture, infrastructure, energy, water, and others. That will take time, okay? Now let's be focused. Occasions like this one, summits where people come, do their promotion about their achievements, and mostly PR exercise. Let's get out of this cycle, first and foremost, okay? I would like to focus on my own issue. Now people are talking about the resources of the continent, 60% of this endowment, 20% of this endowment. Why can't you mobilize your own resources rather than extend your hands for handouts and charity? Is there a way of mobilizing these resources in the continent? How do you mobilize these resources? Can you mobilize the resources of Niger that are going to Europe, uranium and what have you? What about the mineral resources of this continent? Are you mobilizing these resources for the development of the continent, for climate change? What are these resources? Everybody is talking about their achievements in their own locality, in their own national borders, without even addressing the real issues challenging this continent. Talk about the continent's challenge and try to find solutions for this challenge, okay? We're talking about climate change, we're talking about resources, you are talking about so many things. Don't divert focus on non-issues, okay? Now, do your homework, come up with a definition of your goals and objectives, strategize, go for detailed plans, and then come to mobilize resources so that you implement your programs. Otherwise, I don't want to waste your time and waste my time talking about our achievements in Eritrea.
I'd like to get the perspective of Your Excellency Barbara Corford, just to give us a perspective of what are some of the commitments ACU prepared to make in supporting African industrial adaptation. Madam.
Well, thank you very much. Makes it a little bit difficult now to have that shift. But I'm trying my best because, of course, I would agree that any country, wherever in the world, should do its utmost to raise their own possibilities to fight climate change. I think that's some common ground we all can agree on. What Germany is trying to do is working together with the world community to solve an issue where we partially also are responsible for, we as an industrialized country have a responsibility to act now, because others are feeling the outcome of climate change very heavily and they didn't do anything to foster climate change. So that's a part of our responsibility, and that's why we want to share also some of the money and some of the wealth gained in Germany with the world community to adapt and to mitigate with climate change. So adaptation is for us a very important topic, because one thing is, Madam President was pointing out, it's important to act now and people feel a difference now. And of course we have to invest in mitigation, that's crucial and that's clear. But in the meantime, people have to survive and people have to have the chance to have a better life. So that's why we have to invest in adaptation also at that moment. For us in Germany, it's a very important part, so it's not only mitigation, 50% of our, approximately 50% of our bilateral support in the issue of climate change is going into adaptation, and therefore the biggest part is going to the African continent. I once named the figure, you might hear it or you can forget it, that's fine. In 21, that was about 707 million euros. Just the bilateral Germany. Then, of course, we are working together with our European partners in Team Europe initiative. And therefore, it's not only about money, it's about coordinating. The financing is the one thing, but the other thing is how to coordinate the common approach and coordinate it also, of course, with the partners from the African Union. So it's coordination and political dialogue on that issue, which is important. And then it's the access. The third thing, I think, is the access of the countries who are in need for climate adaptation measurements. And we have to get better in that. And that's not something I invented or we are so wise in Berlin. It was a very good idea of the African Development Bank to open up under the African Development Fund a climate action window, to have also a technical assistance tool for most vulnerable countries to come and have a reach out to the globally outlined financing tools. I think that is very important. We support that also. 40 million, just that. And the fourth thing is, and I'm really coming to end quite short, Mr. Moderator, Global Shield Against Climate Risk. I make it short. It was at last year at COP, an important tool also in addressing issue of loss and damage. V20 countries having a reach out. There are Pathfinder countries from the African continent. Ghana is one of them, a co-chair on that issue. From the donor side, Germany is the co-chair. And I'm just use the opportunity to reach out to everybody who wants to get engaged in that shield on both sides, being a Pathfinder country with solutions and being a country who is able to support that financially. And the last momentum is the African Adaptation Initiative. My colleague in Sharm el-Sheikh was announcing that we are supporting the secretary to get everything which is needed in organization, operationalization done. 5 million euros last year in Sharm el-Sheikh. We had to move now to prepare that, and that will be on the track as soon as possible.
Well, thank you very much for reminding us what I call the AAA of adaptation is accessibility, availability, and affordability of funding, so you can get to where it's needed in Africa. Now, we're getting a last perspective, equally important. We're supposed to have the Prime Minister of Egypt, but we have a very able Excellency, Minister of Environment of Egypt, Dr. Yasmin Abdel Aziz. Dr. Aziz, my question to you, we're like a few months away from COP28. We had COP27 in your country, where we made big commitment to address adaptation in Africa. Are you happy with where we are today, with the spirit of COP27? It was all about global solidarity. Where do we stand today for what we're achieving in Egypt as we march toward COP28?
Moderator, and it's a pleasure and an honor to attend that on behalf of my Prime Minister. It is a journey, you know. The journey started in Paris, and I can see many in the room that were there in Paris. And that journey started when we, as Africa, spoke with one voice and launched the Africa Adaptation Initiative, which the State Secretary has just mentioned. But it took us 7 years to operationalize a unit that would work to provide access to the African countries to get resources. So that is a long time. Having mentioned COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, there was a lot. The most important was Sharm el-Sheikh implementation agenda on adaptation with the high-level champions, was the FAST, which was the food security initiative, and AWARE, the one on the water, and the nature-based solution that we're sharing, co-sharing with Germany in order to support the continent and other countries from the impact of climate change. But what is really important, 4 key messages as a takeaway from COP27 to COP28 that would package how we would like to see that. Those messages would simply answer, the more we adapt, the more we reduce the loss and damage. That's for sure. So it's not an either or. Do we need double adaptation finance or do we need the loss and damage fund? We need both, and we need both quickly, rapidly, efficiently, and to work in parallel. Secondly, Africa has already launched the Africa Climate Resilience Strategy through the African Union last year. So we have the framework to work, and we have the initiative to access the finance. What we need to do is to work very quickly at the national level to finalize what is so-called the national adaptation plans. And this is key, and I'll tell you why this is key. When we're talking about adaptation, we cannot continue that discussion as if it is the matter of the global south and the global north. No, it is the matter of each and every single citizen on the continent. And the private sector should have a big role to play, but we need to support that. In order to do that, within the MDB's reform, we need to push the MDBs, and here is a message for the ADB and the programs that the African Development Bank is doing, is to de-risk the private sector involvement in bankable adaptation projects with focus on food security and small farmer households. Secondly, to guarantee the exchange rate for our continent to ensure that the private sector does not lose. They're already afraid, they're already at risk, they already cannot see the bankability of the adaptation. So regardless of doubling adaptation finance, which we would like to see as a result of COP26, or tripling, we have to have the plan, we have to have the private sector, we have to have the reform of the MDB to de-risk the private sector, but much more important is that COP28 would come up with a global goal on adaptation that is measurable, indicator. We're assessing against the adverse impact on the most vulnerable community. And this is happening now through the GCF. So no one would tell, we cannot put quantified indicators. No, we can do because the fund was been like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to do something extremely challenging for heads of states. It's just to give you only 30 seconds and to say, if there's one message you want us to take away from this conversation, starting with you as Madam President, what would be that message?
The key message, I think, would be that we have no other solution than to adapt, that we should be trying, we should adapt in whatever we do, especially in terms of financing. We have to be sure that what we get is done according to our needs, to what we want, because I have heard also the President stating this. So with this cautious approach, this is what we should be doing. Thank you.
Moving on to heads of state, President of Sierra Leone, what would be the takeaway message from this conversation in scaling up adaptation?
I think we have spoken enough. We should not move from words to action. Declarations have been made. We've had the grandstanding. I think we should now move from all of those to actual action. And I want to emphasize the point made by the minister from Egypt, that the climate issues are global in nature, and we should approach them that way. This is not the time for blame. The more time we waste in terms of who takes responsibility or where it comes from, the more we will lose in terms of ecologies that we cost our people, especially us in Africa, who need to be developing rather than dealing with disaster management.
Thank you very much. Moving on to His Excellency President of Eritrea, what will be the message you want to share with the audience with regard to the conversation that's important?
It's again, it's the focus that we need to talk about. You're talking about corrupt governments and comparing them with the private sector and promoting the private sector, the private sector, the private sector. You put in place accountable governments, non-corrupt government that will use national resources for the development of the majority. This is not a matter of polarizing the private sector and the public sector. These classical arguments about the private sector, the public sector, that makes sense at all. It's out of context. We need to be focused on this matter. We can't blame governments and bring non-governmental organizations to manage our affairs. That is phenomenal. In Africa, go everywhere. Non-governmental organizations are managing governments and discrediting governments and replacing them with what they call private sector. Can you imagine this makes sense to anyone? Now talk about serious things, okay? You want to implement programs, articulate your goals and objectives in the first place, okay? Strategize on how you can achieve these goals and objectives. Then go for detailed plans, sectoral plans or industrial plans, and then mobilize resource for that. Give these plans and the resources to reliable hands, accountable hands. Government or private sector doesn't matter. It's not a matter of being with or against that party. How do you mobilize these resources to implement programs so that you address climate change?
Thank you.
Yes, focus. Don't get us to some classical discussions about what the private sector can do or the public sector can do. Corrupt governments will not implement any program at all. To talk about real government. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your Excellency, what will be your takeaway from the conversation, quickly?
For me, it's quite clear. First of all, we need everybody because the task is tremendous. We need to act quick, and I would totally agree with His Excellency, President from Sierra Leone. We have to come from discussion to action. That's the most important takeaway, also from that whole event here.
Absolutely. Dr. Yasmin, what will be your takeaway?
Africa speaking with one voice and pushing for a global goal on adaptation in COP28.
All right, so the challenge is, do I remember everything that has been said? For the President of Eritrea, we need to stay focused. We need to have accountable government. For Barbara, your suggestion will be that we can't do it separately. We have to do it together. So global partnership is important. For the President of Sierra Leone, we have to talk and walk the walk and make sure we deliver and stop talking. And then, Madam President, adaptation matters. We need to adapt. We have no other choice in adapting. And last but not least, let's come together and deliver in COP28. Give it an applause. Don't go anywhere. We're going to move on right into our second panel. And I'd like to invite our second panel speakers to come on stage. The purpose of the second session is to then look at some of the commitment and the statement made by heads of states, but also by some of the representatives of the first panel, to take it to now dig a little bit deeper in terms of what the institutions are doing with regard to climate adaptation in Africa. So we have unique perspective on the panel. And first, I'm going to start quickly with Roger from the Gate Foundation for a simple reason he has to leave. And just to give us the perspective, when it comes to climate adaptation and finance, the perspective of the philanthrope. What do you bring to the table, basically?
Thanks very much for the question, and thanks for staying through the panel. I think we at the Gates Foundation really applaud the work of the African Adaptation Initiative, and it's a critical partner of the Green Growth Agenda, of which we really believe builds the kind of resilience you need to see. I think what we play as a role in philanthropic capital is really about what we heard from almost every member of Head of State just a few minutes ago, which is about food security and small-scale producers being the engine of economic growth in Africa. And if you look at the results coming out of COP27, the IPC tells us that adaptation is one of the critical components, but what we saw was a big focus on loss and damage and 30 million, which are 300 million, which is really appropriate for the cost. But if you look at Pakistan alone, the floods from last year, according to the World Bank, estimated losses of over 30 billion. So even with this great pledge coming out of COP27, we still are only reaching 1% of the loss and damage need. So what we heard from the Minister of Egypt is that you're going to have to adapt, and adaptation is really about how those benefits are going to accrue to the most vulnerable. And for us, countries in the West need to do their part, for sure. There's a commitment to double the funding for climate adaptation, and yet right now I think the incremental increases are too slow. They're not reaching the low-income people that need them most, and they're insufficiently focused on, as we heard in the main session this morning, on climate adaptation for smallholder farmers and agriculture. Less than 1.8% are reaching that. So for us at the Gates Foundation, we think there are three critical things. One is that it's got to reach small-scale producers, which globally, these 500 million small-scale producers produce 35% of the food around the world. And they are on the front lines against headwinds of up to 30% of already adaptation, or productivity of where adaptation needs to come into it. So we, as philanthropic capital, have unique roles to play in three areas. One, it's actually to get the right solution to farmers. We have the CGIAR, which stands at the front lines of innovation. They produce over 1,000 innovations a year, and those innovations return 10 to 1. For every dollar spent on R&D, $10 are returned of economic value, and they reach smallholder farmers. Secondly, we know that smallholder farmers are the engine of economic development, and Africa is at the front lines of that. It is not fully benefited from the inclusive ag transformation that adaptation in agriculture brings. It's estimated that for every dollar that goes in for development spending in agriculture, it yields $2, or it's twice as effective as any other intervention we can do. So what I would say the role of philanthropic capital is to drive innovation into solutions that reach smallholder farmers, to make sure we leverage local institutions that understand the needs of smallholder farmers like AGRA, and to work with governments to actually push those changes down into real policies that matter on the ground. And we look forward to working with partners, and we look forward to working with our partners who are already on the stage that are critical for us, and to the governments that are in the room. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Roger, for that perspective from the philanthropy. I know you have to go.
Yeah.
Now we're going to move away from philanthropy, get a perspective of multilateral organization. In this case, the World Bank. And my question to the Senior Managing Director is that looking at the ambition to scale up adaptation finance in Africa, I wonder what the World Bank is doing precisely to respond to that call to action, to respond to adaptation finance in Africa. Is there any way we can innovate to make this funding more accessible to the African countries?
Good afternoon, and the answer is absolutely yes, in the affirmative. And what we need to see is what's happening in the World Bank is over the last, I would say, 20 years, is a systematic shift of our operations to Africa. Well, in 2000, we may only dedicate about 3 billion or 15% of our total loan program to Africa. Today it's half. And it is also, what is important is that the concessional resources are shifted to Africa. That means that about 70% of the so-called IDA resources are now dedicated to Africa. You're talking about $60 to $70 billion over a 3-year period. And that is then also important for climate change financing. And on the climate change financing, in our negotiations, and the previous speakers mentioned also maybe we need some targets. In the negotiations on the IDA replenishment, there was very clearly climate change is a specialty theme, and also that we need adaptation and mitigation. And it was early recognized, and about half of that concessional financing is going to adaptation. What has happened over the last 5 years, to give you here a bit of a sense, is that only for climate change, about $41 billion went to sub-Saharan Africa, of which about half was for adaptation. And what is important is that there is an increasing tendency or trend towards adaptation. Our last fiscal year had well over $10 billion only for adaptation. So that's very, very important that as so much discussion has been having, can we double? No, we should not double. We should triple. And that is how we are looking at this, because I think there is a lack of ambition and there is too much talk and no money on the table. And that is one of the problems. Now then, once you have the money, you need to look at how we do that. And you cannot have only money, you need analytics. For that reason, we have country climate and development reports, because climate and development is linked, and adaptation is the ultimate expression of it. Secondly, we have so-called adaptation and resilience diagnostics. You need the analytics to focus on where you need to intervene, and on that basis you can then do the projects. And much was talked about of food system and about agriculture. Roger mentioned that. That is absolutely essential. When we talk about food security, you need to look at the short-term dimension, but there is an absolute necessity to change agricultural systems. So I think that we need to do, and we need to do together, be it with research institutes like CGR, be it with the government. I would actually see there is a lot more work to be done with African research institutions to promote actually the focus on productivity and sustainable agriculture. But I think those kind of projects can be worked. What we need more is therefore, apart from the concessional financing we bring, we need also to see how we can get the private sector in. Here, the good news was that somebody said we need to de-risk this. We have actually a window for $2.5 billion to de-risk these investments. What I'm saying is that's not enough. I think all the other multilateral institutions should have similar windows so that we get critical mass for de-risking. So that is also necessary. And therefore, what a final intervention is for me, we need to target, namely that we say when adaptation is so important, can we actually agree that these targets are met and that we are held mutually accountable? What governments are doing, what the local private sector are doing in terms of really identifying the projects and the financing, but also what multilateral institutions are doing and what they are bringing to the table. We need to actually turn this really much more into accountability, because we have had too many conversations and too little action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think your message about linking adaptation and mitigation at the same time, we can eat and chew gum at the same time, will resonate in the minds of many Africans as we go to COP28. I'm going to move on to a different perspective. And here, Ibrahim Achao, I'm going to come to you. And that is really to bring in a perspective that's not been talked about in the conversation here. That is to say, because of climate change and the impact it has on land management and drought, is really disrupting our economic growth and the continent. So as we think about the priority for adaptation, I just wonder if you can talk to us a little bit more about where drought actually feature in that conversation, so that we can at least address some of this manifestation of climate change on the African continent. Mr. Chow.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me tell you how pleased I am to see the African Adaptation Initiative finally trying to take off. Africa did very well in Paris, you remember, at the Paris Climate COP. Two major programs were negotiated, the African Adaptation Initiative and the African Renewable Energy Initiative. And I would like to blend the two because there is no separation between adaptation and mitigation in Africa. If you think about what needs to be done, priority should be agriculture, because that's the primary source of income for Africans. How would you separate adaptation and mitigation in terms of agriculture in Africa? Think about this. African people and farmers produce just to lose half of their production post-harvest for lack of energy. So unless you provide them with the energy that they need, they cannot conserve their food, they cannot process their food, they cannot transform it. So Africa will remain the continent of extraction of resources, including in agriculture, rather than the continent where the economy is thriving thanks to value chains that are created locally. So the lack of energy should certainly be talked about. Second point I wanted to make is that, before I come to your question, is adaptation should not be mistaken for projects. African countries, you like it or not, are spending more of their domestic resources to adapt to climate change than they are receiving from partners. Unless you adapt, you die. So very few people are actually I'm making that point about the investments that are being made currently by the African governments to adapt to climate change with their own meager resources. And think about the disruptions. I'm coming to your question. Over the last 100 years, 300 drought episodes were identified in Africa, happened in Africa over the last 100 years. Over the last 60 years, Africa has lost 60% of its fertile land. Over the last 60 years, the productivity has gone down by 34%. No wonder why there is food insecurity in Africa. Meanwhile, the population has grown by at least 6-fold. So do your math and see where Africa needs to adapt. It is on agriculture. Now, it is very important, if you want to adapt on agriculture, that you invest on your land restoration. Your number one capital is land, is soil. If you don't have land and water, you don't have agriculture. Remember, we depend on few millimeters of rain and few centimeters of soil. So it is extremely important that we invest on that natural capital, and when we talk about adaptation, it is absolutely that. And final point, in terms of actions that are needed, first and foremost, you need clear policy actions from African governments in order to have adaptation as a key priority. It's not about projects, once again. It's about transforming the entire economy of the continent, of the African continent. It is preparing the new development plans. We'll have to feature climate change and adaptation into their plans. Stop thinking that adaptation is projects. Second, think about adaptation finance. Now, I'm not saying that public money is not important. It is absolutely important, and it certainly should be used to de-risk investments. But if you want to adapt to climate change, major private investments will have to come. To do what? Not to help governments, not to help communities, but to help their own business. And it is therefore important that we mobilize both public and private investment. I know you are running out of time, but maybe Ibrahim, I just wanted to say that adaptation should not be mistaken for aid or charity. It is investment. Adaptation is worth investing in. It's business. It's not only public funds. Business should be called to adapt for agriculture. Unless they adapt, they will not do the agriculture. They will not have the coffee or cocoa or banana that they are having in Africa at the moment. It is very important that these investments are made for long-term perspectives. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ibrahima, for bringing it back to that reality of drought on the continent, which obviously, as I said earlier in our panel, affect a lot of vulnerable communities. We're going to bring in a different perspective here. I'm going to ask the Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization. You may have heard many times the Secretary General of the United Nations talk about the importance of accessing early warning system for African countries. We talked about the importance of data. Our policymakers cannot make informed decisions unless they have access to data and to early warning systems. So my question to you, looking at that global perspective, what does it mean for Africa so we can adapt better?
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to come here. As a specialized agency on weather, climate, and water, we are often the messengers of bad news, and I'm not going to disappoint you today either. So we have seen a dramatic increase in the amount of disasters. They have increased threefold during the past 50 years, and we have seen also more than threefold increase of the economic losses. And the most vulnerable countries are the poorest countries. In island states, we have seen GDP losses of several years after one event. And in African countries, we have on continental African countries, we have seen losses between 10 and 20% per year, although the most expensive disasters have been observed in countries like USA and China, but that's not the big issue for their economies. But even the World Economic Forum in its January report was saying that the biggest risk for global economy in the 10-year scale is going to be failure in climate mitigation, and number two risk is failure in climate adaptation. And unfortunately, this negative trend in weather patterns will continue until 2060s, independent of our success in mitigation, and there's no return back to last century's milder climate. And we have already lost this sea level rise and glacier melting game that may continue even for the coming thousands of years unless we create means to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So one of the powerful ways to adapt to climate change is to invest in early warning services. And that's why Secretary General Guterres has given us a mandate to prepare an action plan so that we would improve the situation worldwide. At the moment, only half of our 193 members have proper early warning services in place, and we have also major gaps in the basic observing systems, which means that the quality of the forecasts, for example, here in Africa and also in the island states, is poor because we don't have the basic input data to forecast models. And we have now prepared an action plan for the coming 5 years that by the end of 27, there would be 100% coverage of proper early warning services, and we have already started investments in the basic observing systems through a program called SOF, and we have also started improvement of the early warning capacities of the countries through a program called CRUISE, and we are lucky that many donor agencies have started financing those activities, and our colleagues from World Bank, Green Climate Fund, and also from many donor countries have been allocating resources so that we are able to proceed. And you will get the money back tenfold that you invest in early warning services. And there's a huge need here in African continent and also in the island states, both in Pacific and Caribbean. And this is a great opportunity to improve to avoid both human loss, casualties and economic losses. And there will be benefits for agriculture, transport, health, energy sectors, for various sectors, and also how we deal with the limited water resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tallis. The last intervention, and the last one on this panel, I bring a different perspective here, and that is the perspective of the cities. We always talk about urban resilience as well. I think Jean-Pierre, who is the Secretary General of the United Cities of Local Government of Africa, just walk us through a little bit about the urban resilience and adaptation. What exactly needs to be done to make sure we don't actually forget about our cities?
Thank you to have invited me as the Secretary General of UCLG Africa, the mouthpiece of over 16,000 local governments in Africa, who represent 350 million Africans. UCLG positions is aligned with Africa's position, putting adaptation to climate change and building resilience to extreme weather conditions as the priority of climate action in Africa and calling for closing the imbalance in funding between mitigation action and adaptation action. UCLG Africa also acknowledges the common understanding that adaptation to climate change and building resilience are mainly a territorial, place-based, and contextual issue. Therefore, there is a need that subnational and local governments are empowered through proper devolution policy and financial arrangements to become frontliners in driving the climate adaptation and resilience agenda and connecting it to the biodiversity agenda so that the two agendas are locally intertwined. Subnational and local government and their representative association usually bear the responsibility to organize responses in the proximity when communities are hit by extreme weather conditions. And they do so in most of the time without no means. This is the reason why UCLG Africa proposes to consider putting in place a first rescue and relief facility managed by local government and their representative association in the framework of the Loss and Damage Fund to be adopted at COP28. UCLG Africa further acknowledges the launching by the African Union and of the African Adaptation Initiative as one of the most appropriate mechanisms to accelerate the implementation of adaptation and resilience to climate change on the ground. UCLG Africa is grateful to AMCEN, the African Ministerial Conference on Environment, and the Egyptian government, empowered to do so, to have chosen UCLG Africa to host the technical support unit of the African Adaptation Initiative. But we need consistency in all that we do. And we know, and this was said before, that the line of division between adaptation and mitigation is becoming blurred, which call for better understanding of the potential synergies and co-benefits of adaptation and mitigation action. We need to reframe mitigation and adaptation measures and communicate them as linked and mutually reinforcing. Nature-based solutions offer significant progress against multiple solutions to scale up adaptation measures. We were told that there's no problem of finance. We, at the local government, we encounter a lot of problem of finance. We were told that if there is imbalance between mitigation and adaptation, it's because adaptation don't have appropriate metrics. So we, at the local government, we demand this metrics to you people, because for us, adaptation to climate change is a question of life or death. The mayor of Banjul, here present, witnessed a huge flood with loss of lives. And she told us that women that lost their houses are still sleeping outside 1 year after the disaster. So bring the money to the local government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jean-Pierre, for bringing that perspective of the cities across Africa. We can think about urban resilience. Unfortunately, because we're tight, I will have to just end it here and thank our panelists before we bring in our last speaker to close the session. Give him a round of applause. Now, as I said in the first panel, one of the key takeaways from COP27, we can only address the climate crisis through global solidarity. One of our speakers, bringing the Asian perspective, happened to be from China. I'm going to actually invite the Minister of Environment of China to come on stage and deliver his statement. Just for your information, 30 years ago, I lived and studied in China, So the expression, the speech of actually the minister will be in Chinese. So how best to introduce him in Chinese? So if you can actually get your headset, we'll say something in Chinese. So 现在啊，我很容易邀请中华人民共和国环境部长黄仁秋介绍我的介绍，谢谢。
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Charles. Thank you very much for your kind invitation.
And if you can have your device, we're going to translate actually.
各位尊敬的阁下，各位同事，非常抱歉，因为刚才我在上面有一个国别发言，所以晚到了一点。女士们、先生们，大家下午好。我很高兴啊。我很高兴出席这一次的会议，与各位同行就加强适应力度进行交流。中国政府一贯坚持减缓和适应并重，实施积极应对气候变化的国家战略。2022年，中国出台了国家适应气候变化战略2035，就适应气候变化工作做出了系统的安排。当前，中国正在积极推动省级行政区编制实施应对气候变化的行动方案，预计到今年年底，2/3以上的省份将完成发布实施。中国政府8个部门共同梳理了城市适应气候变化的10大任务，并于上周部署启动深化气候适应型城市建设的试点工作，得到了相关城市的积极响应。中国还积极推动气候变化影响和风险评估，以及关键脆弱领域和区域的适应气候变化工作，我们取得了积极的成效。此外，中国积极响应古特雷斯秘书长提出的全民早期预警倡议。今年4月，中国生态环境部、国家气象局与世界气象组织共同签署了关于支持联合国全民早期预警倡议的3方合作协议，将在气候变化南南合作框架下，共同开发实施早期预警的合作项目，为包括非洲国家在内的发展中国家提高适应气候变化能力提供实实在在的帮助。2021年，中国与非洲国家共同发布了中非应对气候变化合作宣言，确定建立新时代中非应对气候变化战略合作伙伴关系。未来中方愿意继续加强与非洲国家的务实交流合作，分享中国适应气候变化的政策行动和经验，为全球提高适应气候变化能力做出我们的积极贡献。同时关于加强适应力度，中方有4点建议：一是加快制定全球适应的目标框架，识别并授权全球适应目标下一个阶段工作重点和活动安排，继续作为巴黎协定缔约方会议 CMA 下长期的议题，为各方采取积极的适应措施和合作，识别全球适应目标进展差距，强化全球适应行动安排，提供指导。二是加大适应气候变化的支持力度。发展中国家正在为适应气候变化投入大量的国内资源，发达国家应按照巴黎协定的要求，切实加强对发展中国家适应气候变化资金、技术和能力的建设支持，特别是在气候资金支持中，进一步体现适应与减缓之间的平衡，明确到2025年 适应资金比2019年水平翻倍的路线图。三是加快推动损失损害基金的运转，不断完善圣地亚哥网络机制建设，为发展中国家应对损失与损害提供切实的帮助。中方期待与各方加强沟通协调，推动相关的议题取得积极进展。四是加强全球适应气候变化的合作，各国应进一步加强国际交流与合作，分享有益的实践和成功的经验，共同扩大全球适应行动的规模，强化适应气候变化的合作伙伴关系，增强适应的行动有效性和持久性，促进气候韧性的发展。中方愿意继续分享中国适应气候变化的政策行动经验，加强与各方务实交流合作，为全球提高适应气候变化能力做出我们积极的贡献。谢谢大家。
谢谢你呢，为了中国和非洲的关系，对中国和非洲的关系觉得很好，对那个他们增加的更好，谢谢你啊。Thank you very much for joining the global solidarity to talk about climate change and what China brings to the table. Now, we set out to have this high-level panel with some very clear expected outcome, and I believe one could say that this outcome have been achieved. Number one, we want to raise the profile of climate adaptation for Africa. I believe from the panel we have so far and the statement, we still have achieved that goal. Number two, we also set out to actually renew our commitment and our support to Africa-led initiative and adaptation. And I could not think of a better initiative than Africa Adaptation Initiative, which is behind this event today. Third, we set out this panel to really underscore the importance it has to be inclusive, including the private sector. So therefore, all stakeholders, philanthropy, private sector, all involved, what we care about in Africa, and make sure we at least meet our commitment so that demand is made, hopefully, to the conversation and the commitment we heard. We believe we have achieved that objective of this event. We've also heard some commitment in terms of dollar sign from some of our partners with the hope that we can get more, to get in the billions, because the gap is huge. So hopefully the announcement is just a teaser as we go to COP28. Last but not least, we want to make sure, this being the first Africa Climate Summit, at the declaration, we have a line there that says how adaptation is extremely important for Africa. So we're watching the declaration to make sure that line is there. So as we go to COP28, to underscore the importance of adaptation. So on that note, I want to actually thank you on behalf of the organizer, which I have to come on stage. Come and join me. They're a bit too shy. These are the people that deserve a round of applause. So they've been sitting there quietly and silently. But if I'm able to do what I just did for an hour and a half, it's because of these people. And they deserve a round of applause, I think. So on that note, thank you very much for showing up. And this is really the beginning of a journey as we walk to COP28. So make sure that adaptation is important. And yes, we can adapt and mitigate at the same time. We can eat and chew gum at the same time. Thank you very much.